When it comes to retro game collecting, there's a lot of happiness to be had. We've all experienced our moments of triumph, whether it be scoring a deal or finally getting your hands on a game that you've always wanted. That being said, collecting requires decisions to be made, and wherever there's decisions to be made, there's also mistakes to be made. Just ask any multiple choice test I ever took. Perhaps the biggest thing I hear people say they wish they'd done differently when it comes to collecting games is simply starting sooner. And I'm not talking about waking up at 6 a.m. instead of 8 a.m. on the weekends to get a jump on yard sales. Oh no. I'm talking about having started collecting years and years ago, a time when most people didn't care about certain older consoles as much as they do now, and unfortunately that group of most people also included you. That's right, when it comes to people's biggest regrets in life, things like your one true love that got away, taking school more seriously, or visiting your grandmammy a few more times before she passed away, all fall behind in rank to collecting older video games back when they were cheaper. I mean, just think of where your life could be right now. Instead of having way too many games, you could have way too many games. If that doesn't make your heart ache, then I don't know what could. Thing is, even if we did eventually get some of the hard to find games, it sure would have been nice to have gotten them more easily, right? Not to mention, plenty of us still have tons of games that we would have wanted but never got, potentially leaving us in a situation nowadays where there's basically no chance of acquiring it. For example, I always thought Little Samson would be a fun game to have, but the prices nowadays, yeah, that ship has sailed, got lost at sea, sunk by a lightning storm, and eaten by sharks. The thing about going back in time to collect retro video games when they were cheaper is that it would have to be only one of us who got that magical power. Otherwise, we'd all be after that stuff and back in the same situation we are now. To a less extreme degree, I think some of us may regret having not gone looking for games at places like garage sales or flea markets back when it was more likely to find something good at those. Although, if it's any consolation, I would go pretty regularly back in 2011, and I never really found much of anything. Heck, one of the best things I ever got was a faulty GameCube controller that still doesn't work quite right. In fact, you know what? I'm gonna go ahead and say that I regret going to all those flea markets and garage sales. At least going to as many as I did. It wasn't worth my time. Waking up at the crack of dawn on a weekend morning to be one of the first people at a garage sale, only to find a handful of people picking through somebody's old dishes. Yeah, I've got better memories than that. Okay, so far we've covered that acquiring games back when they were cheaper would have been nice, but some of us would settle for simply not losing our games. And by losing our games, of course I mean by selling or getting rid of them. Geez, we were going the wrong direction. If you hung on to your games from your childhood, then major kudos to you, but a lot of us weren't so wise. Money was tight, games could be turned into money, and we were suckers for the next newest video game thing. Remember, back in 1996, the N64 was about excitement, not message boards full of people dumping on the design of the controller the way it is now. It's easy to say in hindsight that we were idiots back then, but we wanted to play the newest consoles at the time of release when the hype was at its max. Kind of ironic considering so many of us have far less excitement for some of the newer consoles nowadays. I think history will remember some of the consoles from the 80s and 90s fondly, heck, a lot of us sure do. So being able to experience those generational shifts as they were happening has got to be worth something, right? Sure, we sold off games and it may not have been worth it, but I don't think it was entirely a bad decision. That is, unless you owned a game that had sentimental value. That's something that can't be replaced. Sure, you could buy an identical piece of plastic, but it really means a lot to have the exact same copy you grew up with. I know some of you still have the original copies of games that you owned earlier in life, and they are very near and dear to you. We're talking the house is on fire and the first thing you grab after your family members is your copy of that game, and maybe the cat, they tend to find their way out. Alright, but what about collecting mistakes that you've made more recently? I'm sure everybody has games that they wish they had bought earlier when they were cheaper, But here's the problem with that. What if you weren't in the mood for those games at that point? I'm not going to want to just start dancing the Macarena at any given time. I understand that it's ideal to collect certain games or consoles when everybody isn't as hyper for them, but there needs to be some enthusiasm for it. Otherwise, what are we doing? Guessing that we're going to like something in the future or that it will be more valuable? Buying something because you think it will be valuable in the future is usually not a good idea for a couple reasons. Number one, everybody will hate you for it, and number two, there's no guarantee it will pan out. For example, I've been hoarding bread bag clips just in case one day there's a shortage, and when everybody's in a panic trying to figure out how to secure their bread bags, who's gonna have the last laugh that day? Well, turns out there are other solutions. Of course, it's possible to get carried away collecting for something you actually are initially into, whether it be games for a particular console, series of games, or what have you. For example, I've seen Mega Man fans go down the rabbit hole collecting for that franchise until they get to a point where they realize, do I really need a US and Japanese version of Mega Man Soccer? Luckily though, most collecting mistakes where you bought something can be corrected easily enough by simply selling off, trading, or giving away whatever it is. However, there are some situations that are not fixed so easily. One of the biggest ways in my mind is buying games in a condition that you decide isn't good enough later on. And no, not just games that don't work. Let me give you an example. Let's say I'm collecting Sega Genesis games, and when I started doing this, I decided just having the cartridges alone was good enough. Then a couple years later, I decide, oh, you know what? Actually, I'd like to have the case and manual too. Oh boy, that's a rough one. Not only is it going to be harder to find a case and manual by itself, but the price is likely going to be higher than if you had just bought the game complete with everything to begin with. And then if you need to do that with the rest of your entire collection, yeah, forget about it. That's going to be a total pain in the butt. The easiest solution at that point might be to just sell all your games and put that towards rebuying them all complete. This type of issue could also apply to just the condition of your games. Maybe when you started collecting you weren't too bent out of shape about what condition your games were in, but later on you decide you'd prefer them to be in better condition. This problem isn't quite as hard to fix, but still a hassle nonetheless, and you may find yourself wishing that you had just bought the game in better condition to begin with. But sometimes you just have something that's in poor condition because that's what was available. You think I prefer my Eternal Darkness manual to be like this? And while we're talking about condition, another collecting mistake could be not taking care of your games. Maybe this is because you just didn't care about some of the games you have as much at one point, or maybe you got a little too aggressive trying to clean them. Yeah, I wouldn't do that. Or it could have been that something happened to your games because you didn't protect them well enough. Earthquake, house could have flooded, your kid playing a game of Will It Flush, who knows? Or going back to having the exact copies of games you had as a kid, maybe you did something to those games you wish you hadn't. Whatever the case may be when it comes to your collecting mistakes, I think it all factors into the uniqueness of your collection. With every collection, there is a story, a ton of decisions, events, and habits that went into why your collection is the way it is. And that includes both the good and the bad. But with all that said, I would like to hear what your biggest collecting mistakes are. I know, it's shocking that would end up being the question for this video. Either way, I do really want to hear what you all have to say. If you want to know my personal biggest mistake, it would probably be not having a single, and I mean not a single, video game thing from my younger years. Oh, actually, you know what? Scratch that. I've got this GameCube stool from the system's launch, and yeah, I'd probably say that it's on the same tier with cats. Alright, so be sure to leave your comments down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah. And he's talking about video games. He's the retro